So on this video, I'm going to start with my value section, and I'm going to start in the background doing a watercolor wash that is also a gradient. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually just paint that section with water. And if your water has a slight tint to it or a little bit of color in it, that's totally fine, because most likely the pigment that you'll be using on top will be much stronger and will just completely cover over it. Sometimes when you are painting like this, when you're just painting with the water, you have to turn and just look at your page at a funny angle to make sure that you've got water going everywhere. Having a little bit of color in the water does actually help with that step. And you may have to add more water to a section that you've already done just to kind of keep it wet.
Teachers, this is a reminder that we are handing out report cards first period. If you have students that are not present, please bring their report card to me and we will mail those out. Again, in your boxes are students' report cards for first period. Thank you.
So just still working on adding water to my whole negative space here. Definitely turn the page so that you have the tip of your brush along any sort of outline that you have. Because whenever you are painting, you want to make sure that you are using the tip of your brush to help you put down the color in the correct spot. You have much more control over where the tip of the brush is versus where any other part of the brush is. And you do not have to use watercolor. So do not feel like just because I am using watercolor in my example that you have to. I'm just using a variety of things so you can see some of the options you have. So now I have water on that whole section, so it's wet, but it's not like soaking wet. And then I'm going to go ahead and pick a color and go ahead and get that color kind of wet. The best thing to do there is just dip your brush in the water a couple times, swirl it around in the color so that the color starts to liquefy a little bit. You don't want it to be too dry, but you also don't want it to have too much water. So now once I've got a good amount of water on my page, I'm just going to kind of do a stripe almost across the top there. Rinse my brush off a little bit at this point. And just kind of paint that down. You'll see that it will naturally get lighter the further away it gets from the pigment source. And there may be little areas where it does go into the positive shape. That's okay. Just do the best you can to keep it out of that section. And it may take more than one layer, just like shading with a pencil would. So if you feel like your first layer does not have a very smooth gradient, don't worry about it. Just let it dry, and you can do another one on top. So now I'm just going to kind of smooth it out a little bit while it's still wet, but it's not as wet now. So just really slow, even strokes. And then again, it will get lighter as it moves down. You can also rinse your brush anytime you feel like you've got too much pigment on it. So like right now, I feel like that's a little bit too dark for that section. So I'm going to rinse and dry my brush a little bit and then go back into that. rinse my brush a little bit, because now I have to do this next part here in very much the same way. And that gradient has a bit more of a space right here. So what I'm going to do is just put a little more pigment on my brush, specifically up here, and go across slowly and evenly. But then this time I'm going to do that same thing that I did on the right hand side on the left hand side. And you'll see that it will start to even out a little bit more, because I put more pigment on my brush at the beginning. So now I've got a smoother transition there. And see how it's kind of making a darker color right where I'm picking up my brush on the end? I will show you how to fix that in just a moment. And so the best way to fix that is to dry your brush off, and then you literally just put your brush there, just hover it a little bit on the surface and dry it off again and do the same thing. This is lifting, which is similar to a watercolor technique, but we're doing it in a very localized way by using just the tip of the brush in an area that just needs a little bit of lightening. So it's really kind of almost like erasing with watercolor. The key is to dry your brush so that your brush will actually pick up that extra water and extra color. And I'm not too worried about some of the imperfections at the top. As long as I have a gradient from dark to light, because that is my value section, I'm good. So I would let that dry, and then I'll use graphite or pencil on the positive shape here, going in the opposite direction. And I'll make sure I film that one as well. So now remember, on your line one, you can use colored pencil, you can use pen, you can use marker. Again, any sort of combination. I most likely will use Sharpie on that one as well, and use a combination of colors, maybe do a color scheme, and then I would be going over my lines that are in pencil, but probably adding some other lines as well. The texture one, I'm going to use tissue paper, kind of scrunched up and glued down, and I will definitely film that part later. The space one, I will probably end up using colored pencils, but I'm going to be doing darkest in the front, lightest in the back, warmest in the front, coolest in the back, and then I'm going to do the space to where it's a gradient that shows distance. So it's going to be white at the bottom and blue at the top, because blue is one of those colors that recedes. And then if I feel like I need to add yellow in that background to emphasize the distance a little bit more, I could. And then on the form, I'm going to keep her silhouette black. So I'm going to go ahead and color that. And then the cylinder, the cone, and the little box that she's in, I will shade with the colored pencil to make them look three-dimensional. And then right now I'm not 100% sure on my background for this one yet, but I will develop that one as I go. Remember, typically you do want to start in the background and work your way to the front, but with a project like this, that is not as important, because the most important thing, once again, is making sure that you illustrate each element clearly. So the background, unless it is part of the element, is kind of not as important. So again, I'm just kind of going around. I'm going to be coloring her silhouette in black, but I want to make sure that I'm not overstepping into the area where I have form. So I'm going to do a thicker outline before I add the rest of the black in between. And turning constantly so that the tip of my pen is right along the edge of where I am coloring or filling in black. And with Sharpie, I find that the best way to color is kind of like this, either with a thick or a thin Sharpie. Go all the way across that shape in one line as much as possible, because it will make your coloring much smoother and neater. There are obviously going to be some shapes where you can't do that because they're too large, but do the best that you can with that, and it will become more normal and natural, and you'll get better at it as time goes on. So then I would be doing the same thing up here. Making that little outline sort of around where the black is going to be so that I don't go into my forms with my black. I think I just dipped my hand right into my painted section. Going to turn so I've got the tip of my pen along that edge. And then I'm going to fill in that space. And you absolutely could go ahead and switch to a thick Sharpie at this point as well, even if you outline with a thin Sharpie. So for instance, if you have a larger shape like this and you don't want to use a thin Sharpie because it would take forever, do the outline with a thin Sharpie and then go back in and fill in the gaps with the thicker Sharpie if you have the same color. That's always perfectly fine. So there she's got her silhouette in black, and I will be using shading on the forms to make them look three-dimensional, and I would be picking a light source as well, so I'll kind of like draw a little sunburst here to remind myself that the light source is here, and I may or may not leave that in there. Chances are I will leave that in here because instead of doing a background on this shape, or on this section, I can use the sunburst to show that the light source matters with form. So it emphasizes the form aspect there a little bit. So I'm going to continue working on my example. There will be more videos, there will be more images, but hopefully that helps you guys kind of get started with your coloring and detail steps.